I would like to share my experience with you all, as it was something that made me change into who I am today. Some info just before that though. I'm a Brazilian guy, 20 years old today, but I was around 12 or so when this story happened. Just a normal school day, boring subjects, annoying people, you know, the usual. I come from a good family with a somewhat good financial situation, so at the time I had with me a Motorola V3 cell phone. That was like top tier back in the day, and it was really uncommon for the other kids to have one. Every day after school, it would take a while for my father to pick me up with his car, which used to be a silver Mariva. That was also the same car he would drive me to school with. One day, I was waiting for my dad to come pick me up, so I was playing some new Super Mario Bros. On my DS, which of course I took to school with me. And that's when I heard my cell phone ring, and I heard the voice of a somewhat cheery man. "Hey Pete, it's your Uncle Paul. I'm here to pick you up for Dad. Come outside." I simply answered with okay and left through the gate. Thing is, it was still fairly early, way earlier than my dad usually picks me up. When I thought about that, I went back inside and waited for another call, and it came pretty fast. "Where are you?" the man asked. Yeah, I'm here, I don't see you." He breathed a heavy sigh and began to give me some instructions. "I'm with the same blue Corolla that I dropped you today in the morning, Pete, come on." He hung up. He was getting impatient. My 12-year-old brain processed what was happening and connected the dots. The thing is, I had no uncles with a name that started with P. Also, it couldn't be my mom's brother either, because he'd been dead for quite a while now. No one called me Pete either but my family, being my brother, sister, and my parents. I started to get a bit nervous and talk to my friends about this. After all, some of them were still there. Basically, all they said was, "Yeah, dude, that's really sketch." Now, I'm not one to usually take charge myself, so instead I went to the principal for help. On the way there, the man called again, and I picked up. This time he was angry. "Why the fuck are you taking so long, you son of a bitch? Blue Corolla, are you brain dead? Get out here with that stupid video game of yours." Then he hung up. Instantly I froze, and many thoughts began to rush through my head. Is this a kidnapper or something? Is this a prank? I started running to the principal's office. I was getting nervous, so I called my dad. He answered in a hurry, and I took a deep breath to not seem scared. "Hey, Dad, did you by chance send someone named Paul here to pick me up?" My heart was pounding to hear what I wanted. "No, whoever's calling you, don't go outside, I'll be right there." He hung up after. I went into the office building bursting in tears, asking for someone to get the man that was probably out there waiting for me in a blue Corolla. I gave the teacher and the principal the number he was calling me from, and they called as well to no avail. They decided to go outside together and check this blue Corolla by themselves. I stayed behind in the office as I got more calls. This time I picked up. My hands were shaking, but I knew at least now he could not harm me. "What's taking you so long, you little shit?" he screamed. "Listen, I know you're no uncle of mine. You have no idea which car I come to school in. You're trying to kidnap me or something. I'm not going out there." He whispered something quietly. I couldn't hear him, so I screamed and called him sick and crazy. "Again, you're not coming out again. You've been out. You just know better. Fuck you." He screamed before laughing like a maniac and hanging up. I held the phone in my hands and stared at nothingness for a while. The teacher and principal came back in saying there was no blue Corolla outside. Shortly after, my dad arrived, and I was escorted to a taxi with him and the guards. I sat there and did nothing, as my dad talked on the phone to track the number that had been calling and find this person by the name of Paul. I took the rest of the week off school, and eventually I started to have nightmares about being outside and being grabbed. After this all happened, I did go back the next week and instantly joined the kendo club in order to know something about self-defense, especially if I got the chance to be armed with something. Years later, my mom and dad divorced. I saw that coming though. After all, when this episode happened, I was living with my older brothers because they didn't want to involve me in all their fights. Once I came back home with my mom, though, I found out they had divorced because my father had 5 lovers in 5 different places. Some of them had even tried to harass my mother. That made me wonder, could all of this kidnapping story have been a scheme from one of these lovers to steal my dad from us? If it was, that just makes me uncomfortable to know a human being is capable of killing someone's kid just to get what they want. Good thing is, I'm 20 today and I've never heard from that Paul again. I still wonder though what would have happened to me if I'd lapsed a bit and didn't have the knowledge to go back inside and kept looking for that person instead. From 2006 to 2008, I was a student at a university in England, studying paramedic science. This course was a 2-year fast track into becoming a qualified paramedic and EMT. The course involved placements at various points throughout both years. First, we spent an evening/night in a dispatcher's. I'll never forget some of those calls, like a man waking up in bed next to his wife only to find she died during the night. Next, we were stationed with the patient transport service, taking patients to their hospital appointments when they couldn't get there alone. And finally, after waiting a good 6 months for the opportunity, it was time to spend a prolonged placement with the 999 crews. You could choose a couple of preferred locations, and I was fortunate enough to be given the ambulance station close to my own home. Because of this, I moved back to my parents' home that winter for a full term, leaving my university buddies behind. In hindsight, I really wish I hadn't. The station was in Buxton, Derbyshire. Google Map it, it's middle of nowhere territory. It's also 45 minutes from the nearest hospital, so you better not get hurt badly up there. Only, of course, people did. So one evening, we respond to a call where a guy has come off his bike on the Cat and Fiddle Run. It's named after a pub by the same name on that road, which passes over the Pennines, a set of mountains. Bikers love to bomb it up and down. It's notorious. Guy broke a brick wall with his body. Legs were over his shoulders. We took him with blue lights to the aforementioned hospital, and I don't think he survived. This is where things got very messed up. We turn out of our hospital, travel maybe half a mile, and get flagged down by this pedestrian. She shouted through the window that somebody had been badly beaten. We later found out this was the case of somebody bumping into somebody else in a bar, nothing more. In that exact moment, a guy in a red shirt kinda stumbled out from a side street and collapsed into the road. I had been in the rear passenger seat of the patient compartment, with my mentor and her technician riding up front. They got out before me to help him, whilst I opened the side bay. Stupidly, I climbed out as my mentor helped him in. That's the point when I noticed 2 things. This man was not wearing a red t-shirt. He was topless and was saturated head to waist in his own blood. And now I realized there was a mob of people rushing straight towards us. 10, maybe even as many as 15. I can't exactly remember. I was still outside the ambulance and was pretty much frozen in terror. I was only 19 at this point and still kind of a pussy. Thankfully, my mentor hauled me inside and locked the doors instantly. She turned back to me, asking if the rear door was locked. It was not. They opened it from the outside. My mentor pushed them back, and I couldn't believe it. Started to heckle them, telling them to pick on a group of people and not just one man. She managed to kick them out and lock the door herself. What happened next will stick with me forever, clearly as I'm telling the story nearly 10 years on. The people surrounded us and began to try and flip the ambulance over. Meanwhile, another guy started hammering the side window. He shattered it and even cut himself wide open with blood spraying everywhere, but he kept on going. They were like animals. There was a window between the rear and the front cabin. We could see a police car fast approaching. He didn't stop though and continued straight past. I don't really blame him for not wanting to take on 15 people all by himself though. Only later did I find out that the keys were still in the ignition as well. Nobody attempted to enter the cabin through sheer luck. After a while, the violent hooligan mob dispersed. but not before leaving a lasting mark on my psyche. You ever have one of those older brothers who likes to pull mean pranks on you and tries to scare you to death? You know the type I'm talking about, surely. The kind of brother who tries to convince you a monster is under your bed or the boogeyman lives inside your closet. Do you know anyone who had an older brother like that? Well, I didn't have one. I had a younger brother who was like that. My little brother Tommy was not only 3 years younger than me, but also a very tiny thing. Physically, he was not threatening in the least, but mentally, he had an imagination that could scare the shit out of people 3 or 4 times his age. The worst thing he ever tried to do to me happened when we lived in a house in a new subdivision. After we'd all moved in, all 4 of us kids got our own room for the first time in our lives. Being the second oldest, I got the second choice of bedrooms. The room that I picked was not only the second biggest, but also had another feature I really enjoyed. It was very unique to the other rooms in the house. There was this trap door in the closet that led underneath the house. It was actually kind of weird, but I thought it was really neat. This trap door led to what you might call a crawl space, I suppose. It wasn't really shallow enough that you would have to crawl in it, though. A human being could very easily stand straight up and underneath the house with nary a problem. My brother Tommy just loved the idea of that trapdoor. He was actually quite mad at me for getting what he felt like was the most interesting feature in the entire house. About a month after we'd moved in, he was still trying to get me to trade rooms with him so he could have the trapdoor in his closet. After that month of refusing, I suppose he finally snapped and got angry with me. "Fine, if you don't want to trade rooms with me, then I'll leave you and Matilda alone," he told me. With that, Tommy turned and began to leave the room. Although I should have known better, I had to ask Tommy what the hell he was talking about. "I'm talking about Matilda," Tommy replied. "She's a homeless woman who lives in the crawl space. Actually, she was squatting in the house before we moved in. Once we showed up, she had to hide underneath. I figured I'd be nice and try to take this room off your hands since I'm not as big a chicken as you are. But I suppose if you want her, you can stay in the room where she has the most direct access to the house." With that, Tommy turned and swiftly left the room. I had to give it to my little brother, he had outdone himself this time. While this story did indeed give me the creeps though, I knew it was just his attempt to get me to trade bedrooms with him, and I was not about to give in. Well, Tommy didn't give in either. He began to taunt me on a daily basis about this Matilda lady. He described her as an ugly, fat old hag lady dressed in ratty blue dresses. He told me he would often talk to her, and she told him she would sneak up into the house when the family wasn't home to grab food. She would then take it back into the crawl space. She would cook it over an open fire. Tommy told me that he told Matilda how much he wanted my room, and once even asked her if she would help him get it from me. According to Tommy, she'd readily agreed she would help scare me out of the room, but she had to pick the time, not him. I supposed it was a brilliant tactic on the part of my brother. It really left it open-ended as to when this imaginary woman would come attack me. This was his attempt to keep me on edge all the time. My brother was very smart after all, like I told you. When I still didn't budge though, my brother stepped up his torment. He started doing something to me every night before bedtime. He would taunt me, singing about how she lived in the crawl space through my door. Even though I really didn't believe him, it did unnerve me as I laid there in bed. I would always sneak a glance over at that closet and that trap door. As I went to sleep, I heard the voice of my little brother in my head, as he whispered over and over about how she lived in the crawl space. My brother's head games did begin to work, but I still didn't want to give in to him. In fact, it just had the opposite effect. I was even more determined to resist. It kinda made me mad he'd found such an effective way to get into my head. About a week after my brother had his little taunts, he came to my room again and was bugging me once more about Matilda. Right in the middle of his little game, though, we suddenly heard a noise. Tommy froze up and then slowly turned and looked over to the trap door. "What the hell?" he asked, fear appearing on his face for the first time maybe in his life. The moment he said it, I looked over and saw the trap door begin to lift up a bit. Tommy jumped and I scrambled up onto my bed. "Holy shit, what the fuck?" Tommy screamed and jumped up with me. "Oh my god, that must be Matilda," I shouted. He looked at me confused. "Dude, what the hell are you talking about? You know I made that up just to get this room, right?" I looked over to Tommy, then back over to the now lifting trap door. "Well, then what the hell is that?" Before either of us could answer, the trap door banged again. Tommy ran to the other side of the bedroom and cowered in fear. My little brother, the king of horror, cowered away in the corner. "Tommy, I'm gonna go check it out, okay?" I told my little brother as I hopped off the bed. I slowly and cautiously began to walk over to the trap door. "Don't! I'm sorry I tried to scare you, but don't go over there!" I didn't listen. "You're my little brother and it's my job to protect you," I told him. "If someone's down there, I have to find out what's going on." Tommy actually began to cry as I approached the trap door. With every bit of caution, I leaned over. I slowly reached my hand out in order to grab the brass ring on top of the door and pull that trap door open. As I did so, the door was thrust open in my hands. A hand reached out and grasped my wrist. I began to scream, and as I did, the hand pulled onto me. It was holding me tight, and it would not let me go. Tommy was still screaming and crying, and started screaming for our parents to come help. Well, the noise and the commotion caused my parents to sprint into the room. They saw what was going on. My mom ran over to Tommy and held him tight. My dad came over and fully pulled open the trap door, revealing our older brother Joseph standing in the crawl space with a big dumb grin on his face. Holding my arm, my dad looked over to me and saw a grin on my face as well. Remember when I said I didn't have an older brother who would torment and scare me? Well, I didn't, but that night Tommy sure did. I recently moved to Colorado because I've always heard such stories about its beauty, and I've always been a really big fan of nature. Well, the fact that they legalized pot in the past few years really didn't hurt either, but that's kind of beside the point. I honestly had never seen the Rocky Mountains before, and I wanted to experience all the wonders of nature that John Denver was so ecstatic about that he had to write all those songs. Well, I wasn't disappointed. Colorado had a lot to appreciate. In addition to the mountains and forests and everything else, I also noticed that Colorado has a lot of tunnels as well. I mean, I suppose it does make sense. When you have so many mountains, you have to have a lot of tunnels too. I was particularly fascinated, however, with the train tunnels. Unlike car tunnels, train tunnels are not particularly well lit, and they're only really thin enough for the train to go through. There's a minor ledge on the side for a person to be up on just in case they're in there with the train, but other than that, there's really not much room. For some reason, I had become fascinated with these tunnels. I really wanted to try and walk through one of them, just to see what it would be like, you know? They were very old, looking like they had been constructed in the 19th century for all I knew. I just found them really fascinating. Now, before I go any further, I need to tell you what happens. This story has nothing to do with the actual train. I didn't accidentally go into the tunnel when a train was supposed to be coming, then run to the exit, only to just get out of there in the nick of time or something. Beforehand, I actually looked up the schedule online and was able to find a good period when there were no scheduled trains running for almost the entire day. That was the perfect time for me to go and explore. This tunnel I was going to was a particularly long one as well. Getting there was a little bit difficult even. Although there were no barriers, there was a lot of traffic on the interstate, and it went all throughout the mountains, of course. I was headed towards this tunnel in the middle of day, so I didn't have the cover of darkness to conceal me. I also wasn't brave enough to try and sneak into a tunnel at night. Instead, I put on an orange hazard vest. I wanted to at least try and make it look like I belonged there. I got to the tunnel without much incident and held my breath as I went to venture in. It was really neat and really light at first. As I mentioned though, this is a really long tunnel and there isn't really much lighting in the middle. Once I was far enough away from the entrance, it was pitch dark. I had brought along a flashlight, but I sort of wanted to see how long I could walk before it got so dark I couldn't see anymore. As I started walking down the tunnel and into the mountain, the light behind me got dimmer and dimmer. I knew I had almost a day's worth of time, so I wasn't in a particular hurry. Eventually, after a bit of winding, I was in the pitch black. It was pretty awesome, I have to tell you. I took out my flashlight and shone it along as I went on. It was so dark that puny little beacon of light barely made an impact. As I continued walking in this silent darkness beside my footsteps, I heard a noise a bit off into the tunnel. It sounded like someone else was walking as well, but I doubted that could possibly be the case. I mean, what are the chances that someone else was walking this far into the train tunnel at the same time I was? Only a few moments later, though, I began to hear it again. It definitely sounded like some sort of footsteps, and it was coming from the direction I was walking toward. I wondered if this might be an animal or something. I began to get concerned. I didn't know all the wildlife that was in Colorado, and I was walking through a narrow tunnel deep into a mountain. It was not going to be easy to get away unless I was able to find a ring to turn me invisible. I considered turning around and going back because I kept hearing that sound over and over. As I stood there and tried to listen a bit closer, I began to hear what was definitely the clacking sound of shoes. It was coming from even deeper inside. I was in a bit of a quandary here. The ledge I was walking on was not particularly wide, so if I turned around and began to walk away out of the tunnel, I would be turning my back completely on what could potentially be a dangerous person. It would be very difficult to defend myself if I were to be attacked. If I kept walking forward though, I could simply be presenting myself to them. I really didn't know what to do now. I stood there waiting, feeling like time was going on and on. I heard the footsteps coming slowly closer and closer. I still wasn't sure what to do. Finally, I took my flashlight and tried to shine it deeper down into the tunnel. It took several moments to notice, but I finally saw a figure approaching through the darkness. It was a hunched-over person whose face looked very morose, with his eyes completely closed. He was a pale gray color, but I figured that might just be because of the darkness. I stood there frozen as he continued to get closer and closer. Eventually, he stopped in place, and then the most terrifying thing happened. He moved his head, and I realized that was not his head at all. He was holding what looked like a decapitated head in front of him. At least, there was a large bag that had a similar shape that he was holding. He smiled at me with his eyes still closed and called out, "Hey, you want to join my head collection?" I turned around and booked it out of that tunnel like you would not believe. I have no idea if the man tried to follow me, but even if he did, he was much smaller and older than I was. I really doubted he would be able to keep up. In that moment, I didn't particularly care either. I just ran and didn't stop until I not only reached the end of the tunnel, but sprinted through the opening, got to my car, and drove off onto the interstate. I really don't know what the hell that was, or how that man seemed to get a human head, but I know I'll never go wandering into train tunnels ever again. This isn't a particularly long story, but it is easily the scariest thing that's ever happened to me in my entire life. When I was a younger child, I was deathly afraid of the typical things. Monsters in my closet or something hiding underneath my bed. I would always have to check both of them before going to sleep, so much so that it became a daily routine. I would go over, open the closet door, have a good look around, and then close and latch it. Afterwards, I would go over, kneel down in front of my bed, and peer underneath. After I confirmed that there was nothing there, I would turn off the light and hurry over to my bed, which was placed up against the wall. I would keep myself against the wall until I fell asleep. Of course, I always felt silly in the morning and promised myself I would not do it again the next night. Regardless, when the next night rolled around, there again I would be. I was about 11 years old when, for the first time, I had a friend over to spend the night. My parents had this weird rule that we couldn't have friends stay overnight until we reached the age of 11. I don't really know why that specific age, but anyway, my friend Kevin and I watched some scary movies after my parents went to bed. When we were done, he went to my room. He put a big sleeping bag on the floor right next to my bed. It was a sleepover, so we weren't really planning on going to sleep just then. He laid down and started chatting as I was laying on my bed and he in his bag. Suddenly, he got up, went over, and turned out the light. I actually felt a bit of a jolt go through me because I hadn't expected him to do that. As Kevin got back into his bag and we continued to chat, I found that doing so had become somewhat strained. For the first time since I could remember, I was in my room in the dark without having checked either the closet or under the bed for intruders. Of course, the fact that we had watched scary movies really didn't help either. While we lay there in the dark talking, Kevin seemed to realize I was really tense. He made some bad gay joke that I was scared he was going to make a move on me, and we both laughed a bit together. I tried to relax for a while and keep chatting, but it wasn't long before Kevin had drifted off and stopped responding. Laying there awake and somewhat alone now was a bit frightening to me. I tried to just close my eyes and go to sleep, but it was too difficult. I knew I had to do my routine or I would not be getting any sleep that night. Of course, I couldn't turn the light on without Kevin waking up. I had a little book light on my nightstand though, so I grabbed it and moved out. I listened to Kevin's snores as I hopped off the bed very lightly. I crept over to the closet, making as little noise as I could. I turned the doorknob very slowly until I heard it click open. Opening it a bit, I shone the book light into it and confirmed it was indeed empty. I closed the door and made my way back over to the bed. I crawled up onto it because I figured I could just lean over and peer underneath. I took the light and slowly looked over the side, only to find myself looking into the eyes of a little boy hiding under my bed. I jumped in fright and dropped the book light on the floor. Kevin, of course, came out from underneath, laughing his ass off at me. Heaving from under the bed, he told me he was sorry, but he just couldn't resist when he'd woken up and saw me checking out the closet. He just had to try and scare me. I appreciated that. I mean, that's what male friends do to each other. Still, I asked him to turn the light on for me so I could calm down a little bit. He got up, went over to the light and flipped it on. When Kevin looked back at me though, he turned as white as a sheet. I followed his gaze toward the foot of my bed to see what had scared him. There was a little girl our age standing at the foot of the bed in a nightgown. I couldn't see her face for some reason. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'd like to play." The lights went out, and then when they came back on, she was just gone. Kevin stood there for a moment before asking if he could sleep in the same bed tonight. Yes was my only reasonable response. I'd woken up in the middle of the night, but I wasn't quite sure why yet. Not only did I work 12-hour shifts during the day, which obviously weared me out, but I was one of those really deep sleepers, even when my alarm clock would wake me up. It took me a little while to realize that it was indeed my alarm clock going off. Even then, I had a really hard time shaking the grogginess. After a few moments, I realized my daughter was standing on the side of my bed, trying to wake me up apparently. I fumbled around for my glasses, but I couldn't find where they were. Couldn't remember where I'd left them either. She was tugging on my sleeve, so I gave up finding them immediately. My wife was out of town, so I had the whole bed to myself. Somehow, I rolled all the way over onto the other side. I was so exhausted, I didn't want to do anything. I just gave up and asked my daughter what was wrong. "There's a ghost in my room," she told me, fear evident in her voice. If my wife had been home, she would have let her climb into bed with us. I, however, really didn't like that kids have to get over being scared of the dark. That was not going to happen if parents continued to baby them and indulge their fantasies about ghosts and monsters. "Sweetie, there's no such thing as ghosts," I told her. "You need to go back to bed. Daddy has to work in the morning and you can't go to school all tired either." "But there's a ghost in my room, I swear there is," I groaned. I didn't believe this sort of nonsense, and I wasn't happy my daughter was obviously believing it either. I rolled over and managed to pull myself up to a seated position. "Sweetheart, it's not true. Whatever's in your room is just your imagination. Now, go back to bed." My daughter stopped for a moment and seemed to think about what I just said to her. "Okay, Dad, could you at least check my room for me to make sure?" I supposed it would be the best way for me to get back to sleep. "If I check your room out, will you go back to bed?" "I promise," she told me. I hopped up out of bed and went out of my room and into the hallway. I felt like I was almost drunk as I stumbled around. I was so exhausted I could barely even walk straight. The only thing I knew was that when I got back to bed, I might never wake up again with how tired I was. When we got to the room, my daughter jumped into bed and got under the blankets. "Check in the closet, please." Slowly, I made my way over. Grabbing the door, I rolled it open and looked inside. Of course, there was nothing there. I let her know this. She seemed very pleased. "Okay, check under the bed too. Will you go to bed right after I do?" I asked her. She promised, so I staggered over, grabbed the side of the bed to steady myself, and when I had the leverage I needed, I lowered myself down and peeked under the bed. Much like I had expected, there was nothing there. I was about to straighten myself back up when the grogginess started to clear up a little bit, and suddenly I realized something. My daughter had gone with my wife to visit her parents, and I was supposed to be in the house alone. I felt like my heart stopped as I thought back to that character now on the bed. I quickly jumped up to my feet, only to see that no one was there anymore. Nervous now and just a little bit scared, I jumped away. I half expected someone to reach out and grab my leg or something. Shakily, I made my way back to my bedroom. I turned all the lights on, because I'll admit, I was pretty scared. I repeated the same routine I'd done in my daughter's room. Checked under my bed, in the closet. I checked everywhere else as well. Nothing to be found. I slept with the light on that night. When my wife got home, I told her what had happened, and she got a pretty good chuckle out of making fun of me. Now, whenever my daughter comes to my room claiming she's seen a ghost or a monster, I just let her crawl into bed with me.